listener production. Hello, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, why calls are now growing for a royal commission into the CFMEU after more damning allegations of violence and corruption. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Tuesday, the 18th of March. There are fears more than 200 people, including many children, have been killed after Israel launched a number of new airstrikes across Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he ordered the strikes on Hamas targets because of a lack of progress to extend the ceasefire. The White House says it's been consulted over the latest escalation and supports Israel's actions. A coronial inquest has started into the death of a young water polo coach who was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in a Sydney school in 2023. The court heard Paul Thyssen stalked his ex-girlfriend Lilie James and meticulously rehearsed her brutal killing. The 21-year-old suffered serious head injuries and her body was found in the bathroom of a gym at St Andrew's Cathedral School. After murdering Lilie, Paul took her phone before driving to Vaucluse and killing himself. And an extraordinary discovery in the central west of New South Wales. Scientists unearthing a new species of fish that could be more than 15 million years old. The freshwater fish fossils were discovered near Mudgee and have been preserved in incredible detail, giving scientists an unprecedented opportunity to understand Australia's ancient ecosystems. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on what's being called one of our largest corruption cases in Australian history. There are growing calls for a royal commission into the CFMEU after more damning allegations of violence and corruption. Joining us this afternoon is ABC journalist Sharnelle Vella to unpack the latest twist in this explosive story. Sharnelle, thanks so much for joining us. Pretty explosive allegations regarding the CFMEU were revealed with an investigation, a joint investigation from 60 Minutes and The Age. Unpack it for us.
So what's astounding about this is that it's part two. So Nick McKenzie made he investigated, and what he found about the CFMEU back in August was big enough. He revealed that bikies were working on CFMEU sites that were state government sites. Now, this is all a part of Victoria's Big Build, which is one of the biggest infrastructure programs in the country. When he made those revelations, it sent the state government in Victoria into crisis mode. They were scrambling to work out how they would respond. And it came out on the Monday, Premier Jacinta Allen came out and said they would, quote, pull this rotten culture out by its roots. So that was the first time we'd heard about corruption, the CFMEU, and what was going on big build sites. And they promised that they would stamp it out. The very fact that Nick McKenzie has been able to now come out with a part two shows that this is still going on, that there's still corruption going on, and it is embarrassing for the Victorian state government and for the federal government as well. You can break this down, the Sunday revelations, into two parts. There was one part which centred around Mick Gatto, who is a very colourful figure here in Melbourne. He's very well known, and there were allegations made about him that he is the connection between the CFMEU and the kind of payments that are going on, the standover tactics that are going on. He denies those allegations. He wouldn't come out and speak to 60 Minutes itself. He didn't speak to any reporters, but he did go on a podcast and he says, I've done nothing wrong. There's nothing shady about what I do. And if you've got something to charge me on, come ahead and charge me. Go ahead and charge me. So he's very adamant that everything is above board with him. The second part of what Nick McKenzie revealed was the relationship between women and the CFMEU. And what he had was some really damning vision of a man who is alleged to be part of the CFMEU beating a woman. Now, he's alleged to have beaten her while he was on his lunch break from the CFMEU, and he's alleged to be a health and safety officer for the CFMEU. There was another woman who spoke to Nick McKenzie, and she said that when she applied to work for the CFMEU, the text messages that came back said, can you send us some pics? basically wanting her to send nude photos of herself. She declined to do that and therefore did not get work with the CFMEU. Those are the allegations that she makes. So really damning allegations once again about the CFMEU and their dealings here in Victoria.
So, Sharnelle, we knew after Nick's initial investigation with these serious allegations against the CFMEU and, of course, alleged underworld infiltration of this very powerful union, that then it was forced into administration. So the majority of us thought, okay, everything's sorted. They're into administration. They won't be as powerful and this will all be cleaned up. As you mentioned there earlier, part 2 of Nick's investigation has revealed allegedly that the CFMEU is just as powerful as ever.
That's right. And that's when Nick's investigation becomes really startling, because there was a promise to clean up the CFMEU, to appoint administrators back in August. But by all means, it appears that this is still going on. So then the question becomes, what is the political fallout around this? Well, we've seen Mr. Dutton, federal opposition leader, come out and say he wants the CFMEU to be deregulated. He says if he wins the federal election, he will deregulate the CFMEU. As far as federal Labor, the current government, are concerned, is they say that that won't do anything and it won't fix the actual problem. There's also a lot of donations that went from the CFMEU to the Federal Labor Party. None of that money has been returned at this stage. And Nick McKenzie asked the question at a press conference of the Premier, saying, through all of his investigations, it seems, and certainly when I was a journalist looking at this, I knew of one MP who was made aware of corruption and standover tactics within the CFMEU, yet no one has been accountable in the state government in the sense of, losing their job or standing up and saying, I was aware of this, I should have done more of that, to use the term, no heads have rolled. And the Premier couldn't answer why that hasn't happened or if anyone within her government should be held to account. So there are now calls for a broader investigation into the CFMEU that not just looks at the CFMEU itself, but goes and dives into Parliament and into their offices to find out what MPs knew, not just the Premier, but what MPs knew and why they didn't act.
Sharnelle, you spoke earlier about the Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen. Now, she said, quote, she was sickened to the core by some of these allegations that Nick has exposed during his investigation. And then I'm of the understanding that then the Premier came out and said these extra measures will be put in place, but then that has backfired because those measures were already in place and some may argue allegedly they were doing nothing.
Well, that's right. So the Premier held a snap press conference on Monday to respond to these allegations. And what she announced was Operation Hawk. Now, she said Operation Hawk was to look at blackmail, extortion, assaults and threats to life. There wasn't much detail in that press conference about how Operation Hawk would work. And that's probably because after journalists left that press conference and did some digging, they found out that Operation Hawk was already up and running and had been for some time. In fact, it had been up and running since August. So this was slightly embarrassing for the Victorian state government. And then journalists were trying to get to the bottom of it to try to work out, well, what's gone on here? They're trying to talk to Victoria Police. They're trying to talk to the Premier. And then what happened was, after all the reporting just last night about, this operation already being in place, came some clarification that said, oh, yes, it is already in place. We're going to expand it now. So you would look at that response and think, does anyone really actually know what's going on? Is this being handled properly? Mr. Dutton has labelled the Premier's response here as a wet lettuce response, says it's not tough enough. But again, this is one of those situations where they say they're doing something, you hope that they are, and you just hope Nick McKenzie doesn't have a part 3.
In regards to that, Sharnelle, a part 3, what we see across the board, and we can have many examples, we'll see all levels of government from over many years, they'll announce a Royal Commission, for example, into aged care. Now there's calls even for a Royal Commission into childcare with some recent allegations. Then there are now calls for a Royal Commission into the CFMEU and this alleged underworld infiltration of this incredibly powerful union. Obviously, there are some pretty serious allegations that are still surfacing, especially that really confronting video with the alleged assault of that woman. What happens from here? Do we need a Royal Commission? if it does happen, is it really going to change one of the most powerful unions in this country?
I think there are a lot of Victorians that would like to see a royal commission. We know that the CFMEU's presence on work sites here not only obviously has a role in keeping people safe, but there are questions around how much does it actually cost taxpayers when you have the CFMEU on sites, sometimes shutting down sites, adding workers, you've got all these allegations. And so far the federal government has denied requests to audit individual projects to see what involvement or where the CFMEU stands on those projects. I think we're getting to the point now where you've got politicians calling this Australia's biggest corruption case ever, that something needs to be done and it needs to be looked at. Otherwise, you don't know how deep it runs. And if you don't know how deep it runs, you can't keep offering up surface level answers or options to try and fix it. I think what's happening with the CFMEU is obviously still happening with administrators appointed. And so there needs to be a real rethink at the moment about what they're going to do about it. But of course, you've got a federal election coming up, so that timing always plays into it. But so far, we've seen that it's just being handled at state level and that there is a little bit of resistance to calling a royal commission.
So on that point, great point you make, Sharnelle, there is a federal election and I'm sure Mr Albanese wants nothing to do with this situation at the moment. And then Mr Dutton, to his advantage, would say, no, I need to make this front and centre. Surely This is not just a Victorian scenario, though. There are allegations that this type of behaviour is widespread. Does there need to be a royal commission? Do you think we will see that front and centre? What needs to happen? Because obviously any proposals or measures they've already put in place, even though the CFMEU is in administration, these alleged behaviours are continuing.
That's right. And I think when you say as well how awful that vision was of what was played on Sunday night, it certainly shocked me and I was quite startled by what I saw. And when you see that happening and we've already seen a state government, and as you say, there's been CFMEU issues in other states. We've seen premiers come out and saying we've got this handled. But I think we probably are getting to the point where there needs to be a royal commission so we can get to the bottom of this. Everyone knows, and this is the real crux of the issue here for me, is unions are there to keep people safe. I've got family members who work on work sites. Everyone knows someone who's a tradie, and unions at their core are there to keep people safe. And if you've got all of this going on, the question is, are they doing that? Are they still doing that with all of this going on? And that is why I think it deserves to be a royal commission, because we need to ensure that the basic practices of union, keeping workers safe, are at the heart of what unions do. And at the moment, it looks as though that may not be the case for the CFMEU.
Incredibly well said. We appreciate your analysis and for joining us today. Thank you, Sharnelle.
Thanks so much.
And that was ABC journalist Sharnelle Vella. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us so you don't miss our episodes or our deep dive of the day. You can also follow us on our socials, on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and also on TikTok and YouTube. You just need to search Listener Newsroom, which is spelled LISTNR. And we'll be back in your feed from 6 a.m. tomorrow. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company. See you tomorrow.